been a minister long enough for it to have had a bad effect on him. I just grow cold when I think of my layer cake. Oh, Diana, what if it shouldn't be good? I dreamed last night that I chased all around by a fearful goblin with a big layer cake for a head." "It'll be good, all right," assured Diana, who was a very comfortable sort of friend. "I'm sure that piece of the one you made that we had for lunch in Idlewild 2 weeks ago was perfectly elegant." "Yes, but cakes have such a terrible habit of turning out bad when you especially want them to be good," sighed Anne, setting a particularly well balsam twig afloat. "However, I suppose I'll just have to trust Providence, and be careful to put in the flour. Oh, look, Diana, what a lovely rainbow! Do you suppose the Dryad will come out after we go away and take it for a scarf?" "You know there's no such things as dryads," said Diana. Dinah's mother had found out about the haunted wood, and had been decidedly angry over it. As a result, Dinah had abstained from any further imaginative flights of imagination, and did not think it prudent to cultivate a spirit of belief even in harmless dryads. "But it's so easy to imagine there is," said Anne. "Every night before I go to bed I look out of my window and wonder if the Dryad is really sitting here, combing her locks with the spring for a mirror. Sometimes I look for her footprints in the dew in the morning. Oh, Diana, don't give up your faith in the Dryad." Wednesday morning came. Anne got up at sunrise because she was too excited to sleep. She caught a severe cold in the head by reason of her dabbing in the spring on the preceding evening, but nothing short of absolute pneumonia could have quenched her interest in culinary matters that morning. After breakfast she proceeded to make her cake. When she finally shut the oven door upon it, and she drew a long breath. "I'm sure I haven't forgotten anything this time, Marilla, but do you think it will rise? Just suppose perhaps the baking powder isn't good. I used it out of the new can, and Mrs. Lynde says you can never be sure of getting good baking powder nowadays, when everything is so adulterated. Mrs. Lynde says that the government ought to take the matter up, but she says we'll never see the day when a Tory government will do it. Marilla, what if the cake doesn't rise?" "We'll have plenty without it," was Marilla's unimpassioned way of looking at the subject. The cake did rise, however, and came out of the oven as light and feathery as golden foam. Anne, flushed with delight, clapped it together with layers of ruby jelly, and in imagination saw Mrs. Allen eating it, and possibly asking for another piece. "You'll be using the best tea set, of course, Marilla," she said. "Can I fix the table with ferns and wild roses?" "I think that's all nonsense," sniffed Marilla. "In my opinion, it's the eatables that matter, and not flummery decorations." "Mrs. Barry had her table decorated," said Anne, who was not entirely guiltless of the wisdom of the serpent, "and the minister paid her an elegant compliment. He said it was the feast for the eyes as well as the palate." "Well, do as you like," said Marilla, who was quite determined not to be surpassed by Mrs. Barry or anybody else. "Only mind you leave enough room for the dishes and the food." Anne laid herself out to decorate in a manner and after a fashion that should leave Mrs. Barry's nowhere. Having an abundance of roses and ferns, and a very artistic taste of her own, she made that tea table such a thing of beauty that when the minister and his wife sat down to it they exclaimed in chorus over its loveliness. "It's Anne's doing," said Marilla grimly. "Just," and Anne felt that Mrs. Allen's approving smile was almost too much happiness for this world. Matthew was there, having been inveigled into the party only goodness and Anne knew how. He had been in such a state of shy nervousness that Marilla had given up on him in despair, but Anne took him in hand and so successfully that he now sat at the table in his best clothes and white collar and talked to the minister not uninterestingly. He never said a word to Mrs. Allen, but that perhaps was not to be expected. All went merry as a marriage bell until Anne's layer cake was passed. Mrs. Allen, having already helped to a bewildering variety, declined it. But Marilla, seeing the disappointment on Anne's face, said smiling, "Oh, you must take a piece of this, Mrs. Allen. Anne made it on purpose for you." "In that case I must sample it," laughed Miss Allen, helping herself to a plump triangle, as did also the minister and Marilla. Mrs. Allen took a mouthful of hers, and a most peculiar expression crossed her face. Not a word did she say, however, steadily ate away at it. Marilla saw the expression and hastened to taste the cake. "Anne Shirley, what on earth did you put in that cake?" "Nothing but what the recipe said, Marilla," cried Anne with a look of anguish. "Oh, isn't it all right?" "All right! It's simply horrible. Mrs. Allen, don't try to eat it. Anne, taste it yourself. What flavoring did you use?" "Vanilla," said Anne, her face scarlet with mortification after tasting the cake. "Only vanilla? Oh, Marilla, it must have been the baking powder. I had my suspicions of the baking powder. Fiddlesticks! Go and bring me the bottle of vanilla you used." Anne fled to the pantry, and returned with a small bottle partially filled with a brown liquid, and labeled yellowly, "Best Vanilla." Marilla took it, uncorked it, and smelled it. "Mercy on us, Anne! You flavored that cake with anodyne liniment. I broke the liniment bottle last week, and poured what was left into an old empty vanilla bottle. I suppose it's partly my fault. I should have warned you. But for pity's sake, why couldn't you have smelled it?" Anne dissolved into tears under this double disgrace. "I couldn't. I had such a cold." And with this she fairly fled into the gable chamber, where she cast herself onto the bed and wept as one who refused to be comforted. Presently a light step sounded on the stairs, and somebody entered the room. "Oh, Marilla," sobbed Anne, without looking up, "I'm disgraced forever. I shall never be able to live this down. It will get out. Things always do get out in Avonlea. Dinah will ask me how my cake turned out, and I shall have to tell her the truth. I shall always be pointed at as the girl who flavored cake with anodyne liniment. Gil, the boys in school will never get over laughing at it. Oh, Marilla, if you have a spark of Christian pity, don't tell me that I must go down and wash the dishes after this. I'll wash them when the minister and his wife are gone, but I cannot ever look Mrs. Allen in the face again. Perhaps she'll think I tried to poison her. Mrs. Lynde says she knows an orphan girl who tried to poison her benefactor, but the liniment isn't poisonous. It's meant to be taken internally, although not in cakes. Won't you tell Mrs. Allen so, Marilla?" "Suppose you jump up and tell her yourself," said a merry voice. Anne flew up, to find Mrs. Allen standing by her bed, surveying her with laughing eyes. "My dear little girl, you mustn't cry like this," she said, genuinely disturbed by Anne's tragic face. "Why, it's all just as funny a mistake that anybody might make." "Oh, no, it takes me to make such a mistake," said Anne forlornly, "and I wanted to have that cake so nice for you, Mrs. Allen." "Yes, I know, dear, and I assure you I appreciate your kindness and thoughtfulness just as much as if it turned out right. Now you mustn't cry any more, but come down with me and show me your flower garden. Miss Cuthbert tells me you have a little plot all your own. I want to see it, for I'm very much interested in flowers." Anne permitted herself to be led down and comforted, reflecting that it was really providential that Mrs. Allen was a kindred spirit. Nothing more was said about the liniment cake, and when the guests went away, Anne found that she had enjoyed the evening more than she could ever have expected, considering that terrible incident. Nevertheless, she sighed deeply. "Marilla, isn't it nice to think that tomorrow's a new day with no mistakes in it yet?" "I'll warrant you'll make plenty in it," said Marilla. "I never saw your beat for making mistakes, Anne." "Yes, and well I know it," admitted Anne mournfully. "But have you ever noticed one encouraging thing about me, Marilla? I never make the same mistake twice." "I don't know as that's much benefit when you're always making new ones." "Oh, don't you see, Marilla? There must be a limit to the mistakes one person can make, and when I get to the end of them, then I'll be through with them. That's a very comforting thought." "Well, you better go and give that cake to the pigs," said Marilla. "It isn't fit for any human to eat, not even Jerry Boot." Chapter 19.